The Byzantine Empire, a resplendent saga of resilience and enduring legacy. Join us on a captivating journey to the eastern frontier of Europe, to Constantinople, a city adorned with golden domes, paved with gleaming marble, and cradling a millennium of dreams. This is the epic narrative of the Byzantine Empire, the illustrious inheritor of the Eastern Roman legacy. A civilization that soared to magnificent heights, shone with unparalleled brilliance, and gradually receded into the annals of history. The dawn of a new Rome, Constantine's vision. In the year 330, when the world was still in its formative stages and empires were forged from raw stone and unyielding ambition, a pivotal figure stood resolute on the shores of the Bosphorus. Emperor Constantine, with a visionary gaze, surveyed the slender strait that served as a natural divide between Europe and Asia, where the venerable city of Byzantium had reposed for 1,000 years. The air, invigorated by the bracing salt spray of two seas, the Black Sea to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south, carried whispers of destiny. In that profound moment, Constantine perceived not the present, but the boundless potential that lay before him. Old Rome, with its 7 hills burdened by the weight of centuries and an empire that had expanded beyond the grasp of a single governing heart, now felt a distant echo. Here, where the Golden Horn gracefully curved like a crescent moon into the European coastline, Constantine resolved to construct a new metropolis. A monumental edifice that would bridge the ancient world with the epoch yet to unfold. This magnificent city would forever bear his name, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. An unceasing flow of laborers arrived, their hammers resonating against marble and limestone as the sun charted its deliberate arc across the azure heavens. They built not merely with stone and mortar, but with aspirations drawn from the zenith of Rome's grandeur. The Hippodrome rose first, its immense structure capable of accommodating 100,000 souls, while nearby, the foundations for a grand palace were meticulously laid. These were to be halls that would, in time, resonate with the hushed pronouncements of emperors and the gentle rustle of silken robes. As Constantine's city began to assume its destined form, a profound transformation was simultaneously unfolding within the empire itself. Like a colossal tree bifurcating at its trunk, the Roman world was undergoing a monumental division. The Western territories, characterized by their familiar Latin tongue and ingrained ancestral traditions, would continue under the dominion of one emperor, while the East, steeped in Greek culture, thriving with extensive trade, and geographically closer to the mystical lands of Asia, would embark upon an entirely distinct trajectory. This separation became immutable in 395. Upon the final breath of Emperor Theodosius, to his son Honorius were bequeathed the western domains, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Britain. The eastern territories, stretching from the Balkans to the Persian borders, passed to Arcadius. This partitioning of the eagle's wings was not intended to be everlasting, yet everlasting it would prove to be. The Eastern Roman resurgence, a golden age unfurls. The Eastern Empire, in the ensuing decades, discovered its distinct rhythm. While the West grappled with the relentless onslaught of barbarian invasions and pervasive political turmoil, Constantinople ascended to ever greater heights of magnificence. Ships laden with spices and silks from India and Ceylon docked in its bustling harbors, while merchants from Russia navigated the great rivers, bringing furs and amber to its vibrant markets. The city's population swelled to unprecedented numbers for the ancient world, a vibrant, cosmopolitan tapestry woven from Greeks and Romans, Armenians and Syrians, Jews and Goths, all united by the threads of commerce and the burgeoning Christian faith that Constantine had embraced. Within the palace halls, courtiers moved with an exquisite, practiced grace, their ceremonies as intricately elaborate as they were deeply ancient. The emperor, irrespective of who occupied the throne at any given moment, transcended mere mortality. He was the terrestrial embodiment of divine will, his purple robes heavy with shimmering gold thread and dazzling precious stones. When he spoke, it was with the very voice of God, or so the meticulously crafted rituals ardently suggested. This was no crude military encampment, as Rome had once been, but a court of unparalleled refinement and sophistication, where the profound tenets of philosophy and theology were debated with the same fervent passion once reserved for gladiatorial spectacles. Yet, beneath the opulent silks and elaborate ceremonies, the Eastern Empire harbored a quality that would prove infinitely more valuable than all the gold in its coffers: an indomitable resilience. When Alaric sacked Rome in 410, Constantinople remained largely undisturbed. When Attila the Hun cast his terrifying gaze westward, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius too judiciously paid him tribute, observing the tempest pass him by. When the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, the East merely shrugged and persevered, for in their collective consciousness, the empire had never truly fragmented. There remained but one Rome, and it flourished proudly on the Bosphorus. The city blossomed in beauty with each passing generation. Artisans from every corner of the known world converged to embellish its churches and palaces with mosaics that seemed to ensnare light itself, holding it captive in tiny fragments of colored glass. The University of Constantinople emerged as the preeminent center of learning in the Christian world, a sanctuary where scholars meticulously preserved the accumulated wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome, while theologians grappled with the profound mysteries of faith. Libraries overflowed with manuscripts painstakingly copied by dedicated monks, their pages illuminated with resplendent gold leaf and vibrant pigments, destined to endure through the ensuing centuries. In the nascent years of the 6th century, as the morning mist ascended from the Golden Horn and fishermen cast their nets into waters reflecting 1,000 years of history, few could have conceived of the boundless glory yet to unfold. The Eastern Empire, though its populace still identified themselves as Romans, had forged its own distinct identity, its unique rhythm, its resonant voice. It was no longer merely the surviving remnant of a greater entity, but a magnificent power in its own sovereign right. The foundation laid by Constantine transcended mere stone and mortar. It was an idea given tangible form, that civilization could persevere, that knowledge could be safeguarded, that beauty could flourish even as the world around it descended into darkness. In Constantinople's bustling harbors, merchants unloaded treasures from lands so remote they seemed to exist only in dreams. In the vibrant streets, children engaged in games their Roman ancestors would have instantly recognized, yet they spoke a language evolving into something new. It was not precisely Latin, nor quite Greek, but something entirely Byzantine. As the sun dipped below the 7 hills of this new Rome, casting the waters of the Bosphorus in hues of amber and gold, the city settled into its evening prayers. Church bells resonated across the neighborhoods, summoning the faithful to vespers, while in the palace, oil lamps flickered in windows overlooking an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Syrian deserts. This was the Byzantine world in its vibrant youth, strong and self-assured, prosperous and cultivated, poised to embrace a destiny that would carry it through more than a millennium of triumph and tragedy, glory and suffering, until it finally confronted its ultimate sunset in a city that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless nations. Justinian and Theodora, the zenith of imperial ambition. In the spring of 527, a peasant's nephew named Petrus Sabatius ascended to the throne of the Eastern Empire, adopting the illustrious name Justinian. He was not a man of striking appearance. Contemporaries depicted him as short and stocky, with a round face and receding hair. Yet, his eyes blazed with an unyielding ambition that would utterly reshape the world. By his side stood Theodora, once an actress gracing the dusty stages of the Hippodrome, now Empress of the Romans. Her intellect was as keen as any blade, and her beauty, even among those who scorned her humble origins, was legendary. Together they would forge something both magnificent and awe-inspiring, a golden age that would ignite the 6th century like a brilliant comet, piercing the darkness that had enveloped much of the known world. Justinian harbored a dream not of mere conquest, but of profound restoration. He envisioned reclaiming the fragmented territories of the old Roman Empire and reuniting them under a single crown, a single legal system, and a single faith. It was a dream as monumental as it was seemingly unattainable, yet for a brief, resplendent period, it very nearly materialized. The emperor's days commenced before dawn in the palace's private chapel, where he dedicated long hours to prayer, his voice intertwining with the ancient hymns sung by monks that reverberated through the marble halls. Justinian was profoundly religious, some even describing him as obsessively so. However, his faith was not a passive contemplation, it was an active, driving force that compelled him to create, to construct, to perfect the world in accordance with divine will. Upon emerging from prayer, he would immediately immerse himself in the ceaseless work of governing an empire, poring over reports from distant provinces, consulting with generals and legal scholars, architects and theologians. Always pressing, always demanding more. Theodora, meanwhile, held court in her own exquisite apartments, where silk hangings from China captured the morning light, and Persian carpets muffled the footsteps of visiting dignitaries. She had not forgotten her origins among the common people of Constantinople, and her policies frequently favored those whom the aristocracy often chose to disregard: women, slaves, and the urban poor. Her intellect was formidable, her political instincts unerring, and on numerous occasions she would prove to be the stronger partner in their extraordinary marriage. The inaugural grand undertaking of Justinian's reign was not military, but legal. For centuries, Roman law had accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of statutes and precedents, contradictory rulings and antiquated regulations that rendered justice as much a matter of chance as of inherent right. The emperor assembled a team of the empire's most brilliant legal minds and assigned them a seemingly insurmountable task: to organize, clarify, and codify the entirety of Roman law into a single, cohesive system. For 6 years they toiled, and their prodigious efforts culminated in the creation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which would serve as the bedrock for legal systems across Europe for the subsequent 1,000 years. However, law was merely the genesis. In 532, the city was engulfed by the most perilous riots in the empire's history. The Blues and Greens, the rival factions that passionately supported different chariot racing teams in the Hippodrome, united their forces against the emperor, incinerating a substantial portion of the city center and proclaiming a new ruler. For 6 harrowing days, Constantinople burned while Justinian cowered in his palace, preparing for escape by ship. It was Theodora who fortified his resolve with words that would resonate through the corridors of history. "May I never live to see the day when those who meet me do not call me Empress," she declared. "If you wish to flee Caesar, well and good, but I shall stay. I love the old saying, 'The purple is the noblest burial shroud.'" Justinian remained, and his general Belisarius shrewdly cornered the rioters in the Hippodrome, orchestrating the slaughter of 30,000 in a single afternoon. The Nika riots, as they became known, were quelled, but so too was a significant portion of the city center, where others might have perceived only desolation. Justinian envisioned unparalleled opportunity. He resolved to rebuild Constantinople, making it more magnificent than ever before, and at its heart, a church unlike anything the world had ever witnessed would rise. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, was constructed in a mere 5 years. But those years bore witness to the birth of an architectural marvel that would never be surpassed. The emperor convened the most brilliant architects of the age: Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. These were men who comprehended not only stone and mortar, but also the intricate principles of mathematics and engineering, the interplay of light and space, and the very profound mysteries of manifesting heaven on earth. Justinian spared no expense. Marble columns were brought from temples across the sprawling empire, while mosaics of unprecedented beauty began to take shape on walls and domes. When the grand church was finally completed in 537, even the very workers who had built it paused to gaze in awe. The central dome appeared to float impossibly above the nave, seemingly unsupported by any visible structure, while light cascaded through its windows. illuminating mosaics that appeared to move and breathe with divine vitality. On the day of its consecration, Justinian himself is famously said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you!" It was no idle boast. The Hagia Sophia was the largest enclosed space in the world, a veritable miracle of engineering that would stand as a testament to Byzantine glory for nearly 1,000 years. But Justinian's grandest dream still beckoned. In 533, he dispatched Belisarius across the Mediterranean with an army of merely 15,000 men to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals. It seemed an act of sheer madness. The Vandals had held these opulent provinces for a century, their formidable fleets commanded the western Mediterranean, and their king, Gelimer, was no pushover. Yet, within a single year, Belisarius had utterly shattered the Vandal kingdom and reinstated imperial rule from Morocco to Tripoli. The vast wealth of Africa now flowed back to Constantinople, replenishing the emperor's treasury and funding even grander ambitions. Next came Italy, where the Ostrogothic kingdom had held sway since the fall of the Western Empire. This campaign would prove immeasurably more arduous. It would relentlessly endure for 2 decades, devastating the peninsula and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. But when it finally concluded, Rome itself was once again an integral part of the Roman Empire, and imperial banners proudly unfurled from the Alps to Sicily. For a fleeting moment, the Mediterranean once more resembled a Roman lake, just as it had in the glorious eras of Augustus and Trajan. The emperor and empress held court in a palace that had become the marvel of the entire world. Ambassadors from far-flung lands, Frankish chiefs and Ethiopian princes, Persian nobles and Chinese merchants, came to marvel at the sheer splendor of Constantinople. The imperial couple received them in the Chrysotriclinos, the Golden Hall, where mechanical lions roared and golden birds sang amidst jeweled trees, while the emperor himself remained motionless on his throne, clad in robes so heavy with gold and precious stones that he appeared more statue than man. Yet, even in this golden age, ominous shadows began to gather. The plague that would forever bear Justinian's name arrived in Constantinople in 542, carried by ships from Egypt, where it had already wrought devastation in Alexandria. It spread through the densely populated streets with the ferocity of a wildfire, annihilating perhaps a third of the city's inhabitants and proliferating throughout the empire. Even Justinian himself succumbed to the illness, though he miraculously survived while thousands around him perished. The empire's resources, already stretched thin by incessant warfare, were pushed to their absolute breaking point. Theodora passed away in 548, her demise signaling the beginning of the twilight of the Golden Age. Without her invaluable counsel and unwavering strength, Justinian seemed to lose something vital. He became increasingly absorbed in theological disputes, dedicating his final years to painstakingly trying to reconcile the conflicting interpretations of Christian doctrine that perpetually threatened to tear the empire asunder. The reconquered territories in the west proved impossible to retain. Italy swiftly fell to the Lombards mere years after its costly reconquest, while Africa gradually slipped away, piece by agonizing piece. When Justinian died in 565, he bequeathed an empire that was simultaneously grander and yet more fragile than the one he had inherited. The Hagia Sophia still majestically dominated Constantinople's skyline, the legal code continued to govern millions of subjects, and the imperial territories still spanned from Spain to the Euphrates. However, the treasury lay empty, the army was utterly exhausted, and new adversaries were massing on every frontier. The Golden Age was drawing to a close, but its monumental achievements would transcend the impending darkness. These were enduring monuments to human ambition and divine inspiration that would evoke wonder for generations yet unborn. Trials by fire, the empire's enduring resilience. The decades following Justinian's passing brought forth formidable trials that rigorously tested the very soul of the empire. Like relentless waves crashing against the sturdy seawalls of Constantinople, crisis after crisis relentlessly assailed the Byzantine world. Each one threatened to obliterate what centuries of meticulous construction had painstakingly built. Yet, through it all, the empire steadfastly endured, bending but never truly breaking. Discovering renewed strength amidst adversity, and a profound new purpose in suffering. In 568, a mere 3 years after Justinian's demise, the Lombards swept into Italy with the destructive force of a plague of locusts. These Germanic warriors, having honed their art of warfare on the steppes beyond the Danube, descended upon the war-weary peninsula with terrifying efficiency. City after city succumbed to their relentless advance: Milan, Pavia, Spoleto, until the empire's Italian territories were tragically reduced to scattered islands of desperate resistance. Only Rome itself, the port of Ravenna, and a few coastal strongholds that could be supplied by sea managed to hold out. The magnificent dream of reuniting the old Roman Empire crumbled like parchment consumed by flames. But Italy was merely the preamble. Along the Danube frontier, Slavic tribes pressed relentlessly southward in endless migrations, their ox carts laden with families seeking new homes in the fertile valleys of the Balkans. Unlike previous invaders, these Slavs came not to conquer and depart, but to settle permanently, bringing their own distinct language, customs, and gods to lands that had been Roman for centuries. Greek cities that had thrived since the era of Alexander found themselves gradually encircled by Slavic villages, their ancient culture slowly but inexorably transformed by this subtle yet relentless infiltration. In the east, the eternal adversary stirred once more: the Persian Empire. Under the formidable Khosrow II, launched invasion after relentless invasion. Their armored cavalry thundered across the vast Mesopotamian plains, while their powerful siege engines battered the venerable walls of Antioch and Damascus. For 26 grueling years, the war raged back and forth across Syria and Anatolia, consuming untold treasures and lives in quantities that would have astonished earlier generations. Persian armies even reached the very shores of the Bosphorus, while Persian gold clandestinely financed revolts and rebellions throughout the empire's vulnerable heartland. Emperor Heraclius, who ascended to the throne in 610, seemed an improbable savior. He was middle-aged and scholarly, far more at ease with books than on battlefields. Yet he possessed a quality that his predecessors had sorely lacked: the uncanny ability to inspire others to believe in seemingly impossible dreams. As Persian armies encamped within sight of Constantinople's impregnable walls, Heraclius made a decision that utterly astonished his contemporaries. He would forsake the traditional Roman strategy of defensive warfare and, instead, carry the fight deep into enemy territory. In 622, leaving Constantinople steadfastly defended by its formidable walls and the fervent prayers of its people, Heraclius led his army into the rugged mountains of Anatolia. For 6 relentless years, he waged a guerrilla campaign that would have earned the admiration of the greatest generals of antiquity, striking at Persian supply lines, liberating captive cities, and painstakingly forging an alliance with the empire's Christian subjects who had endured immense suffering under Persian rule. His crowning victory arrived in 627 at Nineveh, where his army decisively shattered the last Persian host and sent Khosrow II fleeing to his capital at Ctesiphon. The emperor returned to Constantinople in a blaze of triumph, bearing with him the most sacred relic in Christendom, the true cross, which the Persians had carried away from Jerusalem years before. The city erupted in rapturous celebration as Heraclius processed through the streets, the cross gleaming resplendently in the sunlight, while church bells pealed joyously from every quarter. It seemed as though divine providence had unequivocally vindicated the empire's faith, generously rewarding its suffering with miraculous deliverance. Yet, even as the citizens reveled, new, ominous clouds were gathering on the southern horizon. In the desolate deserts of Arabia, a merchant named Muhammad had begun proclaiming a new faith, one that would soon ignite the world with fervent religious zeal. The Arab armies that emerged from those barren desert wastes moved with the astonishing speed of sandstorms and the unshakable conviction of true believers. Damascus fell in 636, Jerusalem in 638, and Alexandria in 642. Within a single generation, the empire lost its richest provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, to warriors who fought with the unbridled fury of those who believed they were executing God's divine will. The loss of Egypt was particularly devastating. For centuries, the vast granary of the Nile had sustained Constantinople's hungry millions, while Egyptian merchants had carried Byzantine gold to the vibrant markets of India and Ceylon. Now, all that immense wealth flowed to Damascus and Baghdad, enriching the caliphs while the empire struggled desperately to feed its remaining subjects. Heraclius, the magnificent victor over Persia, lived just long enough to witness his life's monumental work undone by enemies he had never even conceived of. When death finally claimed him in 641, he is said to have whispered, "Peace be with you, Syria, and what an excellent country this is for the enemy." The losses transcended mere territory and treasure. With the Arab conquests, the empire shed much of its cosmopolitan character, gradually becoming more Greek, more Orthodox, and more intensely focused on Constantinople and its immediate hinterland. The great theological schools of Alexandria and Antioch fell silent. Their brilliant scholars dispersed or converted, while the empire's intellectual life increasingly revolved around the monasteries of Mount Athos and the esteemed University of Constantinople. In 726, Emperor Leo III made a decision that would convulse the empire for over a century. Convinced that God was chastising the Byzantines for their veneration of religious images, he commanded the destruction of icons throughout the empire. The movement, known as iconoclasm, the breaking of images, tore Byzantine society apart. Monks and nuns who defiantly refused to surrender their cherished icons were subjected to torture and execution, while churches that had taken centuries to adorn were stripped bare in a matter of days. The iconoclastic controversy was far more than a mere religious dispute. It represented a fundamental disagreement regarding the very nature of the divine and how human beings could approach the sacred. The iconoclasts, drawing upon ancient traditions that prohibited the creation of graven images, argued that attempting to depict Christ or the saints was both blasphemous and inherently impossible, as the divine nature could not be captured in mere paint and gold. Their adversaries, spearheaded by monks and popular preachers, steadfastly insisted that icons served as windows into heaven, enabling the faithful to commune with the saints and profoundly contemplate the mysteries of faith. For over a century, the empire agonizingly tormented itself over this profound question. Emperors rose and fell based on their stance concerning icons, while families were torn asunder and cherished friendships irrevocably destroyed. The monastery of Staudios in Constantinople emerged as a focal point of resistance to iconoclasm. Its courageous monks ingeniously smuggled icons to safety and composed hymns that meticulously kept the ancient traditions alive. Meanwhile, fanatical iconoclastic emperors like Constantine V, whom his enemies derisively nicknamed the Dung-Named, pursued their policies with unyielding determination, convinced that only the complete eradication of religious art could restore God's divine favor. The controversy finally abated in 843 when Empress Theodora, widow of the last iconoclastic emperor, triumphantly reinstated the veneration of icons in a ceremony that would be annually commemorated as the Triumph of Orthodoxy. Churches throughout the empire were redecorated with resplendent new mosaics and frescoes, while monks emerged from hiding to resume their ancient and cherished practices. Yet, the damage was irrevocable. Countless works of art had been annihilated forever, while the empire's fragile unity had been irreparably shattered by decades of bitter religious civil war. Through all these profound trials, the relentless loss of territory, the sweeping Arab conquests, the agonizing iconoclastic controversy, the empire, almost miraculously, endured. Like gold refined in a fiery crucible, it emerged from each crisis, perhaps smaller in scale, but undeniably purer in its fundamental character. The sprawling, multicultural empire of Justinian's era had been transmuted into something more intensely focused and cohesive, a Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian state centered on Constantinople, held together by a shared faith and common suffering. In the secluded monasteries of Mount Athos and the studios houses of Constantinople, monks diligently copied manuscripts by the flickering candlelight, meticulously preserving the profound wisdom of bygone ages for generations yet unborn. At the esteemed University of Constantinople, scholars passionately debated the nuanced subtleties of theology and philosophy, steadfastly keeping alive the intellectual traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. And within the majestic Hagia Sophia, now gloriously restored to its full splendor after the cessation of iconoclasm, the faithful congregated to sing hymns that had resonated through these sacred halls for centuries, their voices ascending like fragrant incense towards the golden dome that seemed to touch the very threshold of heaven. The empire had survived its trial by fire, but the flames had irrevocably transformed it. What emerged was not the universal state envisioned by Constantine and Justinian, but something smaller and immeasurably more resilient. A formidable bastion of Orthodox Christianity that would valiantly guard the eastern approaches to Europe for centuries to come. It faced whatever future trials awaited with the hard-won wisdom of those who had already endured the unendurable. The Great Siege of Constantinople, 717 to 718. A city's unyielding stand. The morning sun cast elongated shadows across the glistening waters of the Golden Horn as the colossal chain was hoisted between its shores, hermetically sealing Constantinople's harbor against the formidable fleet that ominously darkened the horizon. It was the summer of 717, and for the second time in less than a century, an immense Arab army had arrived with the singular objective of claiming the city that proudly proclaimed itself the New Rome. Their ships densely filled the sea from shore to shore, while their land forces, perhaps numbering a staggering 80,000 men, spread across the hills of Thrace like a relentless plague of bronze and steel. The Caliph's generals had meticulously planned this campaign with an almost surgical precision. Previous Arab expeditions had faltered because they were unable to sustain their crucial supply lines across the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean. But this time, they had arrived fully prepared for a protracted siege that might conceivably endure for years. Their formidable fleet carried sufficient provisions to sustain an army through multiple harsh winters, while their skilled engineers had brought forth the finest siege equipment that Syrian workshops could possibly produce. They were supremely confident that Constantinople, perceived as weakened by decades of debilitating internal strife and unrelenting external pressure, would capitulate within mere months. However, they had failed to account for Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian peasant who had audaciously seized the throne just 2 years prior. Leo was not a man of refined education or courtly graces. He had ascended through the ranks of the army by virtue of sheer courage and an astute cunning, mastering the art of warfare in the rugged mountain valleys of Anatolia, where every village was compelled to serve as both a fortress and a farm. When the vast Arab army settled into its meticulously constructed siege lines around the great land wall, Leo was poised and ready for them. The siege commenced, as such encounters invariably did, with a deafening barrage from the Arab catapults and mangonels, which hurled colossal stones the size of wine barrels against Constantinople's ancient, formidable fortifications. But the Great Wall had been engineered and constructed to withstand precisely such assaults. Its double line of fortifications, towering sentry posts, and intricately designed gates had successfully repelled every adversary for over 3 centuries. Day after grueling day, the Arab engineers painstakingly filled in the immense moat and advanced their towering siege towers, only to witness them being utterly annihilated by the defenders' counter-fire or consumed by the mysterious weapon that had become the empire's most zealously guarded secret: Greek fire. The enigmatic liquid flame that inexplicably burned on water and defied extinguishment by conventional means had first appeared in Byzantine arsenals during the preceding century. Its precise chemical composition was known only to a select handful of imperial craftsmen, each bound by an oath of absolute secrecy under penalty of death. However, its effects were terrifyingly evident to anyone who had the misfortune of facing it in battle. launched from bronze siphons mounted on the city's walls or sprayed from specially designed galleys in the harbor. Greek fire could transform a wooden siege tower into a raging inferno in a matter of moments, while enemy ships ensnared in its fiery embrace became floating furnaces that no amount of water could possibly quench. As autumn inexorably ceded to the brutal grip of winter, the Arab army found itself inextricably ensnared in an increasingly desperate predicament. The fierce, bone-chilling cold of a Thracian winter, far more unforgiving than anything the desert warriors had ever endured, claimed more lives than Byzantine weaponry. Supply ships meticulously dispatched from Syria were either intercepted by Greek fire galleys or mercilessly driven off course by relentless winter storms, while Bulgarian raiders persistently harassed the army's vulnerable land-based supply lines. Disease, a silent and insidious killer, spread like wildfire through the overcrowded camps, claiming thousands of lives, while desertion relentlessly thinned the ranks of those who had marched northward with such an initial, misplaced confidence. Inside the city's resilient confines, life persevered with the unyielding rhythm of a people who had learned the hard lessons of endurance. Merchants continued to sell their wares in the bustling covered markets, though prices steadily ascended as the siege inexorably tightened its grip. Children, seemingly oblivious to the impending doom, still frolicked in the narrow streets, though their games increasingly mimicked mock battles between Christians and Saracens. In the sacred churches, priests led continuous prayers for deliverance that ascended like wisps of smoke from thousands of flickering oil lamps. Meanwhile, within the majestic Hagia Sophia, the Patriarch conducted special services, fervently imploring divine intervention in the city's direst hour of need. The Emperor himself, Constantine XI Palaiologos, walked the walls each day, his imperial purple cloak exchanged for the practical, unadorned armor of a common soldier. He conversed with the defenders, offering words of encouragement and meticulously inspecting the formidable engines of war that crowned each towering bastion. Leo had long ago assimilated the profound truth that true leadership necessitated sharing the inherent dangers faced by those he commanded. His unwavering presence on the walls, calm, confident, and utterly unafraid, did more to sustain morale than any number of meticulously crafted speeches or official proclamations. When Arab emissaries, under flags of truce, approached to offer surprisingly generous terms for surrender, Leo's response was characteristically succinct. "The city of Constantine will stand as long as Christ protects it." Spring arrived. Yet it offered no solace to the beleaguered besiegers. A second Arab fleet, dispatched from Egypt to reinforce the first, was met in the treacherous waters near Gallipoli by an imperial squadron that had stealthily crept out of the Golden Horn under the cloak of darkness. The ensuing battle illuminated the night sky, as Greek fire transformed the narrow strait into a veritable furnace, annihilating most of the Arab reinforcements and sending the desperate survivors fleeing back towards Alexandria. Simultaneously, Bulgarian armies, cunningly encouraged by Byzantine gold and alluring promises of tribute, commenced attacking the Arab camps from the rear, compelling the already exhausted besiegers to wage war on two fronts. The final, decisive blow originated from an entirely unforeseen quarter. A brutally harsh winter had been succeeded by an even more unforgiving spring, characterized by unseasonably late snows and bitter winds that mercilessly killed the tender shoots of grain across Anatolia and Thrace. Famine, a relentless specter, stalked both armies. But the Arabs, precariously dependent on increasingly tenuous supply lines, suffered immeasurably more than the steadfast defenders, who could draw upon meticulously hoarded reserves stored in the city's countless cisterns and granaries. By midsummer of 718, the once mighty Arab army was but a pale shadow of its former self. Decimated by the ravages of disease, the pangs of hunger, and the unceasing harassment from enemies who seemed to multiply with the legendary heads of the mythical Hydra. In August, after 13 months of futile siege, the Arab commanders finally conceded defeat. Their withdrawal was less a strategic retreat and more a desperate, chaotic rout. harassed at every agonizing step by relentless Byzantine cavalry and their Bulgarian auxiliaries, who had, against all historical precedent, learned to cooperate despite centuries of mutual animosity. Of the once grand army that had confidently marched towards Constantinople, only a meager fraction survived to reach the relative safety of Syrian territory. Meanwhile, the colossal fleet that had once darkened the Aegean Sea was reduced to a mere handful of battered galleys, limping back home with the grim tidings of utter disaster. The unequivocal failure of the Second Arab Siege of Constantinople marked a pivotal turning point in the protracted struggle between the Cross and the Crescent. Never again would the caliphs mount such a massive, audacious assault on the imperial capital, though Arab raids would continue to probe Byzantine defenses for generations to come. More significantly, the siege firmly established the empire's formidable reputation as the bulwark of Christian Europe. The unyielding fortress that stood resolutely between civilization and the overwhelming forces of conquest that swept out of Asia. Emperor Leo III did not complacently rest on his laurels. In the years immediately following the siege, he ingeniously reorganized the empire's military system around the innovative theme system. A brilliant innovation that seamlessly combined military service with agricultural settlement. Each theme functioned as both an administrative district and a military command, populated by dedicated soldier farmers who received land grants in exchange for their essential military service. When enemies ominously approached, these farmer soldiers could rapidly mobilize to valiantly defend their homes. In times of peace, they provided the crucial agricultural surplus that sustained the empire and ensured the treasury was adequately supplied with taxes. The magnificent walls of Constantinople, scarred by countless battles yet still proudly defiant against the sky, became an enduring symbol of imperial tenacity that inspired awe throughout the known world. Pilgrims and astute merchants, seasoned diplomats and erudite scholars, all journeyed to marvel at the extraordinary city that had successfully repelled the mightiest armies of Islam. Meanwhile, chroniclers in distant lands meticulously recorded the miraculous preservation of the Christian empire as incontrovertible evidence of divine favor. Yet, the empire's tenacious enemies did not simply vanish, they strategically adapted. Arab strategies shifted from massive, protracted sieges to swift, targeted raids designed to seize booty and capture prisoners rather than outright territory. Bold Bulgarian khans and opportunistic Slavic princes increasingly probed the northern frontiers with growing audacity. Concurrently, in the west, new formidable powers, the Franks, the Lombards, and the burgeoning maritime republics of Italy, began to aggressively challenge Byzantine control of the lucrative Mediterranean trade routes that had enriched Constantinople for centuries. The resolute defenders, too, adapted with remarkable ingenuity. Imperial engineers painstakingly perfected new versions of Greek fire, creating devastating weapons that could be deployed from ships or even carried by individual soldiers. The imperial fleet, meticulously rebuilt after the profound devastation of the Arab Wars, developed innovative tactics that prioritized speed and maneuverability over the massive, lumbering warships of earlier centuries. Most crucially, the empire's sophisticated diplomatic service, arguably the most advanced in the medieval world, mastered the intricate art of playing enemies against each other, skillfully employing gold and shrewd promises to prevent the formation of dangerous, unified coalitions. As the 8th century drew to its close, Constantinople stood secure behind its impregnable walls, its sacred churches resonating with the harmonious sound of thanksgiving hymns, its bustling markets teeming with astute merchants from every corner of the known world. The great siege had been valiantly survived, the empire had steadfastly endured, and the golden dome of the Hagia Sophia still magnificently caught the first rays of dawn, casting its radiant glow across a city that had profoundly learned to forge strength from adversity and discover hope in the darkest hours of trial. A century of contradictions, shifting sands of power. The century that followed the Great Siege of Constantinople introduced profound changes that subtly permeated the empire like elongated shadows at twilight. These transformations were gradual, almost imperceptible at first, yet they ultimately reshaped everything they touched. The heroic era of Leo III and his successors slowly gave way to an age characterized by complexity and stark contradiction, where brilliant, decisive victories frequently alternated with devastating, demoralizing defeats, and fleeting moments of renewed glory were often overshadowed by undeniable signs of an empire slowly but inexorably weakening. In the nascent years of the 9th century, Empress Irene ruled with singular authority. She was the first woman to claim the imperial title in her own sovereign right, rather than merely serving as a regent for a son or husband. She presented a figure of remarkable contradictions, profoundly pious, yet ruthlessly pragmatic, genuinely concerned for the welfare of her subjects, yet chillingly capable of ordering the blinding of her own son to safeguard her throne. Under her controversial rule, the protracted iconoclastic controversy finally began its slow denouement. As a pervasive sense of exhaustion and practical necessity gradually overcame theological zeal, the empire, more than anything, yearned for unity, more so than it desired doctrinal purity. And Irene comprehended this fundamental truth more acutely than most of her contemporaries. Yet, even as internal peace tentatively returned, external pressures alarmingly multiplied. In the West, a formidable new power had emerged, one that would audaciously challenge Byzantine claims to Roman legitimacy. On Christmas Day of the year 800, Pope Leo III ceremoniously placed a crown upon the head of Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. This momentous ceremony unfolded in the very heart of the old empire, within St. Peter's Basilica in Rome itself, and its profound implications were unmistakably clear. There were now two claimants to the Roman inheritance, and this fundamental division would continue to complicate European politics for centuries to come. The Byzantines were utterly appalled. In their unwavering view, there could be only one legitimate Roman Empire, and it unequivocally resided in Constantinople, the new Rome that Constantine had founded 5 centuries prior. Charlemagne, in their estimation, was nothing more than a barbarian chieftain with unwarranted pretensions. His crown a meaningless bauble arbitrarily bestowed by a bishop who possessed no inherent authority to create emperors. However, reality possessed an inconvenient habit of intruding upon ideological purity. Charlemagne's formidable empire controlled vast territories that had once been Roman, commanded armies that the Byzantines could not realistically hope to match, and possessed resources that dwarfed what meager remnants remained in the imperial treasury. The dramatic emergence of the Carolingian Empire compelled Constantinople to fundamentally reevaluate its position in the world. No longer could the Byzantines unequivocally claim to be the sole, undisputed heirs of Rome. They were now merely one among several burgeoning powers fiercely vying for dominance in an increasingly fragmented world. This stark realization engendered a subtle yet profound shift in imperial psychology. The expansive confidence that had characterized earlier centuries gradually began to yield to a more defensive mentality, one intensely focused on preserving what remained rather than attempting to reclaim what had been irrevocably lost. Meanwhile, new adversaries materialized on every frontier. In the north, the Bulgars, under the formidable Khan Krum, proved themselves to be as relentless and formidable as any foe the empire had ever encountered. In 811, Emperor Nicephorus I led a massive expedition against the Bulgarian capital of Pliska, convinced that an overwhelming display of force would crush these troublesome neighbors once and for all. Instead, the imperial army was utterly annihilated in a treacherous mountain pass, and Nicephorus himself was tragically killed. He was the first emperor to die in battle since Valens had fallen at Adrianople more than 4 centuries prior. Krum, with barbaric glee, had the emperor's skull fashioned into a drinking cup from which he toasted his victories over the Romans. The catastrophic defeat at Pliska sent shockwaves reverberating throughout the empire. If a Bulgarian chieftain could obliterate an imperial army and slay an emperor, what did this grim reality imply about the empire's supposedly divine mandate? Revolts erupted in several themes. while ambitious generals began carefully calculating whether the throne might be seized by someone with superior military credentials than the current incumbent. For a generation, destructive internal warfare consumed precious resources that could have been far more effectively utilized to fortify the frontiers or revitalize the struggling economy. Yet, the empire possessed an almost miraculous capacity for renewal. In 867, a new dynasty dramatically came to power when Basil the Macedonian, a peasant of extraordinary ambition and undeniable ability, murdered his way to the throne. The Macedonian dynasty would reign for nearly 2 centuries, presiding over what historians would later emphatically term the Byzantine Renaissance, a glorious period marked by significant military conquests, remarkable economic prosperity, and an efflorescence of culture that distinctly recalled the glorious days of Justinian. Under the astute leadership of Basil I and his able successors, imperial armies once again marched deep into enemy territory. The Arabs, weakened by their own debilitating internal divisions, were systematically pushed back across Syria and Mesopotamia. Simultaneously, in the west, tenacious Byzantine forces reconquered much of southern Italy from the Lombards and Arabs who had seized it centuries earlier. The imperial fleet, meticulously rebuilt with newer and faster ships, swiftly swept Arab pirates from the eastern Mediterranean, thereby reopening vital trade routes that had been tragically closed for generations. The successful reconquests brought more than mere territory, they brought immense wealth. Gold flowed copiously into Constantinople's treasury from the taxes levied on newly recovered provinces, while thriving Italian silk workshops and flourishing Syrian spice merchants once again generously contributed to the empire's burgeoning prosperity. The capital city itself ascended to even greater magnificence. Its streets were widened and meticulously paved with gleaming marble, its churches adorned with breathtaking mosaics that even surpassed those of Justinian's golden age. The University of Constantinople attracted esteemed scholars from across Europe, while the imperial library grew robust with countless manuscripts meticulously copied from the renowned libraries in Baghdad and Córdoba, thereby preserving invaluable knowledge that might otherwise have been forever lost. Yet, beneath this glittering surface, insidious structural problems were slowly but surely metastasizing. Problems that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire's sustained prosperity. The theme system, which had served the empire so admirably during the desperate years of the Arab invasions, began to progressively break down as successful generals accumulated vast estates and amassed private armies that alarmingly rivaled the imperial forces. These powerful military aristocrats, families such as the Phocas, Scleros, and Melinos clans, became virtually independent rulers within their own provinces. While paying nominal lip service to Constantinople, they aggressively pursued their own self-serving interests with increasing audacity. The emperors found themselves trapped in an impossible quandary. They desperately needed the military aristocrats to defend the frontiers and lead the armies that had secured such spectacular victories. Yet, these very same men simultaneously posed the most profound threat to imperial authority. Ambitious generals repeatedly launched revolts against the throne, compelling emperors to divert crucial resources from external campaigns to suppress debilitating internal rebellions. The empire began, tragically, to consume itself from within, its inherent strength gradually sapped by civil wars that achieved nothing save for the enrichment of mercenary armies and the devastating ruination of provinces that had the misfortune to serve as battlefields. Economic pressures further exacerbated the empire's mounting difficulties. The conquests of the 10th century had been exceptionally expensive, necessitating massive expenditures on armies, fleets, and fortifications that strained even the expanded treasury. Meanwhile, new, aggressive competitors began to emerge in the lucrative Mediterranean trade, which had long been a tightly held Byzantine monopoly. The ascendant Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, meticulously constructed fleets that could rival anything Constantinople possessed, while their astute merchants proved to be far more adaptable and relentlessly aggressive than their Byzantine counterparts. Gradually, control of the immensely profitable trade routes to Asia began to inexorably slip from Greek hands into Italian ones. The empire's currency, the gold solidus, which had been the most stable and reliable money in the world for 7 unbroken centuries, began to exhibit alarming signs of debasement as emperors confronted ever-increasing expenses and rapidly diminishing revenues. The careful, prudent fiscal policies that had steadfastly sustained the empire through its darkest hours gave way to short-sighted expediency, debasing the coinage, shamelessly selling offices to the highest bidder, and imposing crushing, unbearable taxes on whatever provinces still remained loyal. These desperate measures provided fleeting, temporary relief, but at the profound cost of long-term stability. Religious divisions also began to re-emerge, though in novel forms. The iconoclastic controversy was finally and definitively settled, but it was swiftly supplanted by other theological disputes that proved equally divisive and damaging. The Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope in Rome, once uneasy allies in the face of common adversaries, began to assert competing claims to supreme authority over the entirety of the Christian world. Differences in doctrine, liturgy, and ecclesiastical organization that had once seemed relatively minor now escalated into sources of major, intractable conflict as each side aggressively sought to establish its absolute supremacy over the other. The final, irreparable breach occurred in 1054 when papal legates contemptuously placed a bull of excommunication upon the sacred altar of the Hagia Sophia, thereby formally and definitively severing the ties between Eastern and Western Christianity. Patriarch Michael Cerularius retaliated by promptly excommunicating the papal legates, thereby creating a profound schism that would tragically divide the Christian world for centuries to come. The empire, which had once proudly envisioned itself as the sole defender of universal Christianity, now found itself at the head of merely one branch of the faith, Orthodox Christianity, while the other branch, Roman Catholicism, looked increasingly to the Pope and to the rapidly growing power of Western European kingdoms. As the 11th century relentlessly progressed, these accumulated pressures began to overwhelmingly exceed the empire's dwindling capacity to effectively respond. The military aristocracy grew ever more independent, audaciously carving out virtual kingdoms in Anatolia and the Balkans while pledging only nominal allegiance to Constantinople. The economy stagnated as vital trade routes shifted decisively westward, and the empire's once thriving manufacturing centers suffered a precipitous decline in the face of relentless Italian competition. The army, once universally acknowledged as the finest fighting force in the world, became increasingly and alarmingly dependent on foreign mercenaries whose loyalty could be bought and sold like any other common commodity. In 1071, these ominous trends tragically culminated in disaster at the Battle of Manzikert, where Emperor Romanos IV led the imperial army against the formidable Seljuk Turks in the rugged mountains of Armenia. The battle was lost not through enemy superiority, but through insidious treachery and pervasive confusion within the Byzantine ranks. As rival factions within the army brazenly pursued their own self-serving agendas even in the very face of mortal danger, Romanos himself was captured, becoming the first emperor to fall into enemy hands since the darkest days of the Persian Wars 6 centuries prior. The immediate aftermath of Manzikert proved even more catastrophic than the battle itself. With the emperor held captive and the army utterly scattered, Anatolia lay terrifyingly open to a sweeping Turkish invasion. Within a mere decade, the Seljuks had overrun most of the empire's Asian territories, establishing the Sultanate of Rum with its capital at Nicaea, shockingly just a few miles from Constantinople itself. The empire that had once majestically stretched from Italy to the Euphrates was now tragically reduced to little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, plus scattered, isolated holdings in the Balkans and southern Italy. Yet, even in this absolute darkest hour, the empire incredibly endured. A new emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, ascended to the throne in 1081. Utterly determined to restore Byzantine fortunes through whatever means were necessary. If the empire could no longer rely on its own dwindling strength, then it would strategically seek allies wherever they could be found, even among the so-called barbarian kingdoms of Western Europe that had once been dismissed with disdainful contempt. In 1095, Alexios dispatched an embassy to Pope Urban II, fervently seeking military assistance against the Turks, who now gravely threatened the very existence of Eastern Christianity. The emperor's desperate plea would have consequences that no one could have possibly imagined. Within a matter of months, Urban II was passionately preaching the First Crusade, issuing an impassioned call to the knights of Western Europe to march eastward and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Alexios had optimistically hoped for a few thousand mercenaries. Instead, he received tens of thousands of armed pilgrims whose fervent religious zeal was matched only by their profound ignorance of Eastern customs and their deep-seated suspicion of Greek Orthodox Christianity. The Crusades would bring both salvation and profound destruction to the Byzantine Empire. Salvation in the short term, as Crusader victories restored much of Anatolia to imperial control. But devastating destruction in the long run, as deep-seated cultural misunderstandings and competing ambitions would eventually turn the Crusaders against Constantinople itself. For now, however, as the first Crusader armies approached the Golden Horn in the winter of 1096, there still lingered a fragile hope that the empire might yet regain its former glory, that the deepening shadows of decline might once more yield to the brilliant light of renewal. The Fourth Crusade, a Christian city's betrayal and plunder. The morning of April 13, 1204, dawned gray and cold over Constantinople, the waters of the Golden Horn mirroring a sky heavy with the portent of rain. From the towering walls of the great city, watchmen could discern the formidable Crusader fleet anchored in the harbor. This was not the familiar sight of Byzantine dromons with their distinctive Greek fire siphons, but rather the high-sided cogs and galleys of Venice, their scarlet banners snapping briskly in the wind like drops of blood against the pale, ominous sky. For 3 relentless days, the Fourth Crusade had been meticulously preparing for an assault that would irrevocably shake the very foundations of the Christian world. It had never been intended to conclude in such a catastrophic manner. When Pope Innocent III had first called for this new expedition to the Holy Land, the explicit intention had been to strike directly at the heart of Muslim power in Egypt, thereby ingeniously avoiding the long and perilous overland route that had claimed so many lives in previous crusades. The Crusaders had initially gathered in Venice, that proud maritime republic whose astute merchants had grown immensely rich by transporting pilgrims and warriors to the east. And there, they had struck what appeared to be a reasonable bargain with Doge Enrico Dandolo. Dandolo was ancient even by the standards of his own time. Some whispered he was 90 years old. Others claimed he was over 100 and nearly blind, his eyes clouded by milky cataracts that had stolen his physical sight but not his cunning intellect. He had offered to transport the Crusader army to Egypt in exchange for a staggering payment of 85,000 marks of silver, a sum that seemed manageable when the agreement was initially signed, but which proved utterly impossible to raise when the moment came for payment. The Crusaders found themselves hopelessly stranded in Venice, unable to afford passage, yet equally unable to return home without enduring profound humiliation before all of Christendom. It was then that Dandolo had made his fateful and insidious suggestion. The Crusaders could conveniently work off their crushing debt by assisting Venice in reclaiming the city of Zara, which had recently defected to Hungarian protection. Never mind that Zara was a Christian city, ruled by a Christian king who had himself taken the cross. Business was, after all, business, and Venice had substantial investments to protect. The assault on Zara had been swift and brutal, but it was merely the grim beginning of the Crusade's profound deviation from its sacred purpose. From Zara, the expedition had been lured further off course by the alluring, yet ultimately hollow, promises of Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince who asserted that his father, the deposed Emperor Isaac II, had been unjustly imprisoned by his own brother. Restore Isaac to the throne, Alexios promised, and Byzantium would pay the Crusaders' debts to Venice, provide troops for the conquest of Egypt, and most importantly, heal the profound schism between Eastern and Western Christianity that had bitterly divided the Church for 150 years. It was an offer too tempting to refuse, even though it blatantly meant attacking fellow Christians in the very city that had served as the unwavering bulwark of Eastern Christianity for nearly 9 centuries. The initial assault on Constantinople in July 1203 had been almost anticlimactically successful. The formidable walls that had historically repelled Arabs and Bulgars, Avars and Russians, crumbled before the innovative siege techniques employed by the Western Knights. The Crusaders audaciously breached the Golden Horn's great chain, landed troops on the European shore, and ignited devastating fires that consumed entire neighborhoods. Emperor Alexios III fled into the night, cowardly abandoning his capital to save his own life. And the Crusaders, with triumphant arrogance, installed Isaac II and his son Alexios IV as co-emperors, utterly confident that their promises would soon be fulfilled. But the promises proved as ephemeral as the morning mist. The newly restored emperors soon discovered that their treasury was utterly empty, their loyal subjects deeply hostile to the Latin occupation, and their actual ability to deliver on their grand commitments virtually non-existent. Anti-Latin riots violently erupted in the streets of Constantinople, while within the palace, a new, ruthless usurper named Alexios Doukas brutally strangled Alexios IV and imprisoned his father, defiantly declaring that no more tribute would ever be paid to the Western invaders. The Crusaders, camped disconsolately outside the city walls through the bitter winter of 1203 to 1204, found themselves in an impossible and desperate position. They had expended their last remaining resources on an expedition that had yielded nothing but escalating expenses and a multitude of new enemies. Venice's rapacious merchants relentlessly pressed for payment of debts that continued to accrue punishing interest, while the common soldiers grew increasingly restless and mutinous. Some spoke of abandoning the entire ill-fated enterprise and returning home, but others, spearheaded by the most ambitious nobles, began to whisper of a radically different, more profitable solution. If Constantinople would not willingly provide the immense wealth they craved, then perhaps it should be forcibly taken. The final, decisive assault commenced at dawn on April 9, 1204. With a coordinated, ferocious attack on the seaward-facing wall that had, in all the city's long and illustrious history, never before been breached. Venetian ships, ingeniously modified with flying bridges and scaling ladders, relentlessly approached the wall while catapults and mangonels hurled enormous stones and incendiary firepots at the valiant defenders. For 3 grueling days, the battle raged with unprecedented fury. The Crusaders, driven forward by a potent mixture of desperation and unbridled greed, fought with a savage intensity. The Byzantines, conversely, fought with the courage born of profound conviction, understanding implicitly that they were defending not merely their beloved city, but their entire civilization. The critical breakthrough occurred when a small, determined group of crusaders managed to scale the wall near the Petria Gate, swiftly overpowering the guards and thus opening the way for their eagerly awaiting comrades. Within a mere few hours, the entire seaward-facing wall was firmly in Crusader hands, and Byzantine resistance began its agonizing collapse. Emperor Alexios V fled the city in a humble fishing boat, tragically abandoning his loyal subjects to face the impending storm alone. What transpired next was 3 days of unimaginable pillaging that surpassed in both scale and sheer savagery anything Constantinople had endured in its 9 centuries of glorious existence. The Crusaders, many of whom had not received payment for months, descended upon the greatest city in the world like ravenous wolves upon a helpless flock of sheep. Churches were ruthlessly stripped of their golden altars and jeweled chalices. Monasteries were mercilessly ransacked for their priceless illuminated manuscripts and sacred relics. And private homes were brazenly invaded by avaricious soldiers relentlessly seeking anything of value. The Hagia Sophia, the magnificent great church that had been the undisputed pride of Eastern Christianity for nearly 7 centuries, suffered particularly grievous and irreparable damage. Crusader soldiers wantonly smashed the exquisite silver iconostasis, melted down precious golden vessels to mint their own crude coins, and even audaciously led horses and mules into the sacred space to more efficiently carry away their ill-gotten loot. A common prostitute brazenly sat upon the patriarch's hallowed throne and obscenely sang bawdy songs while drunken knights grotesquely danced around her, their raucous laughter echoing blasphemously through the very dome that had once resounded with the most sublime liturgical music in the entire world. The Library of Constantinople, which had painstakingly preserved the invaluable works of ancient Greece and Rome through the darkest centuries of the Middle Ages, was almost entirely destroyed. Manuscripts that had miraculously survived the cataclysmic fall of the Western Roman Empire, the sweeping Arab conquests, and the bitter iconoclastic controversy were ignominiously burned for fuel or mercilessly torn apart for mere parchment. The resulting loss to human knowledge was incalculable. Entire works of classical literature, profound scientific treatises, and invaluable historical chronicles vanished forever in those 3 terrible days of wanton destruction. Perhaps most tragic of all was the deliberate destruction of the city's unparalleled artistic treasures. The magnificent bronze horses that had once adorned the Hippodrome were ignominiously shipped to Venice, where they would forever adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. The colossal bronze statue of Athena, which had majestically stood in the city since Constantine's time, was melted down for its mere metal. Countless mosaics, breathtaking frescoes, and exquisite sculptures that had taken centuries of painstaking artistry to create were destroyed in mere moments by brutish soldiers who saw only the precious materials from which they were made, utterly oblivious to their immeasurable artistic and historical value. When the horrific looting finally ceased, the Crusaders were confronted with the perplexing question of what to do with their ill-gotten conquest. They had successfully destroyed the Byzantine Empire, but they had not, by that act, created a sustainable replacement. The solution they ultimately adopted was to divide the empire's territories among themselves, thereby creating a patchwork of Latin states that would prove as ephemeral as they were artificial. Baldwin of Flanders was declared the first Latin emperor of Constantinople, ruling over a truncated state that controlled little more than the city itself and its immediate surroundings. The Venetians, ever more pragmatic and commercially astute than their knightly allies, claimed the choicest commercial territories, the vital ports and lucrative trading stations that would allow them to dominate eastern Mediterranean commerce for centuries to come. Crete, Euboea, and countless smaller islands fell under Venetian control, along with a significant quarter of Constantinople itself, and the coveted right to name the city's patriarch. The old, cherished dream of a reunited Christian empire was brutally supplanted by the stark reality of Venetian commercial hegemony. Meanwhile, the surviving members of the Byzantine nobility courageously fled to the empire's remaining territories, establishing 3 separate successor states that each fiercely claimed to be the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. In Nicaea, John III Doukas Vatatzes founded what would become the most successful and enduring of these successor states, while in Trebizond, the Grand Komnenos family established an empire that would, remarkably, outlast Byzantium itself. In Epirus, the despotate of Epirus controlled much of western Greece and Albania, thereby completing the tragic fragmentation of what had once been a unified and powerful empire. The brutal sack of Constantinople sent shockwaves of horror reverberating throughout the Eastern Christian world. In Kiev and Moscow, in Bulgaria and Serbia, Orthodox Christians were utterly horrified by the grim news that the great city had fallen not to Muslim infidels, but to fellow Christians who brazenly claimed to be serving God's will. The schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, which had been largely theological before 1204, now became a matter of life and death, poisoned by bitter memories of betrayal and sacrilege that would tragically endure for centuries. Pope Innocent III, upon learning of what monstrous acts had been committed in Christ's name, was utterly appalled. He had called for a crusade to liberate the Holy Land, not to mercilessly destroy the greatest Christian city in the world. You were supposed to recover the Holy Land," he wrote in scathing condemnation to the Crusaders. "But instead, you have spilled Christian blood, despised the cross, and entered the sanctuary of God to rob, destroying and plundering." But his heartfelt condemnation came too late to undo the immense and irreversible damage that had already been wrought. The Latin Empire of Constantinople would endure for a mere 57 years, a brief and troubled existence marred by constant, debilitating warfare with the Byzantine successor states and the gradual, inevitable loss of territory to relentless enemies on all sides. Its emperors, precariously dependent on Western subsidies and expensive mercenary armies, never commanded the genuine loyalty of their Greek subjects, who rightly viewed them as foreign usurpers rather than legitimate rulers. The magnificent great city itself, ruthlessly stripped of its priceless treasures and tragically cut off from its traditional, lucrative trade routes, became a mere shadow of its former glorious self. Its population precipitously declining and its once splendid monuments crumbling from sheer neglect. Yet, even in the absolute darkest hour of its long and illustrious history, the indomitable Byzantine spirit resolutely endured. In the churches of Nicaea and Trebizond, in the secluded monasteries of Mount Athos and the Meteora, Orthodox Christians painstakingly kept alive the cherished traditions that had sustained the empire for more than 8 centuries. They meticulously preserved the sacred liturgy, diligently copied countless manuscripts, and steadfastly maintained the fervent hope that one day the great city would be gloriously restored to its rightful rulers. That fervent hope would ultimately prove to be far more than mere wishful thinking. In 1261, the triumphant armies of the Empire of Nicaea would successfully recapture Constantinople, thereby initiating the final, poignant chapter in the long and complex story of Byzantine civilization. The sunset of an empire, the fall of Constantinople. The summer morning of July 25, 1261, broke clear and bright over the Bosphorus, its waters reflecting the golden light that had blessed Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years. In the harbor, fishing boats gently bobbed at anchor, while seabirds gracefully wheeled overhead, their plaintive cries mingling with the joyous sound of church bells that had begun to peal throughout the liberated city. But these were not the ordinary bells of morning prayer. They were the triumphant peals of liberation, unequivocally announcing that after 57 long years of Latin occupation, Constantinople had gloriously returned to Greek hands. The restoration had occurred almost as quietly and unexpectedly as the morning dawn itself. General Alexios Strategopoulos, leading a small, determined force of barely 800 men, had ingeniously discovered that the city's Latin garrison had sailed away to attack the Byzantine island of Daphnusia, leaving Constantinople defended by only a handful of unsuspecting guards. Working meticulously through the night, Strategopoulos and his valiant men had successfully scaled the walls, audaciously opened the gates, and taken control of the city without significant bloodshed. When the sun finally rose, the majestic double-headed eagle of Byzantium flew once again from the proud walls of the great palace, and the bells of every church in the city jubilantly proclaimed the miracle that few had dared to hope for. Michael VIII Palaiologos, Emperor of Nicaea and now the glorious reclaimer of Constantinople, entered his ancestral capital 15 days later in a triumphant procession that deliberately echoed the grand triumphs of ancient Rome. Dressed in resplendent purple silk and crowned with the ancient diadem that had adorned the heads of Constantine and Justinian, he walked barefoot through the Golden Gate, reverently following the miraculous icon of the Virgin Hodegetria that had steadfastly protected the city through so many previous crises. Behind him marched the seasoned veterans of Nicaea, their armor gleaming brightly in the August sun, while ecstatic crowds lined the streets, eager to witness the awe-inspiring restoration of an empire that many had tragically thought lost forever. The Hagia Sophia, visibly scarred by decades of Latin occupation and the imposition of Catholic ritual, was solemnly and reverently reconsecrated according to Orthodox tradition. The magnificent great church had suffered terribly during the years of exile. Its precious silver iconostasis had been melted down, its sacred vessels sold to finance the Latin Empire's desperate wars, its very soul seemingly extracted by foreign priests who celebrated the Mass in Latin rather than the traditional Greek. Now, as Patriarch Arsenios led the solemn ceremony of restoration, the ancient building seemed to exhale a collective sigh of profound relief. Its golden dome once again brilliantly reflecting the radiant light of Orthodox Christianity. Yet, the restored empire was a pale shadow of the mighty state that had tragically fallen to the Crusaders in 1204. The territories painstakingly recovered by Michael VIII comprised little more than Constantinople itself, fragmented parts of northwestern Anatolia, and scattered, isolated holdings in the Balkans and the Aegean Islands. The great themes that had once formed the robust backbone of Byzantine power, the rich agricultural lands of central Anatolia, the prosperous cities of Syria and Palestine, the Italian territories that had provided both immense wealth and crucial strategic depth, were gone forever, irreversibly divided among Turkish emirates, Latin principalities, and Italian maritime republics that harbored no intention of ever returning them. The empire's finances were in utter ruin. The Latin emperors had shamelessly sold or mortgaged virtually every conceivable source of revenue to finance their desperate, and ultimately futile attempts to maintain power. Simultaneously, the Venetians had shrewdly secured commercial privileges that granted them effective control over what meager remnants of Byzantine trade still existed. The treasury that had once overflowed with shimmering gold from across the known world was now so tragically empty that emperors were compelled to melt down palace decorations to mint the coins desperately needed for even the most basic government operations. Even more profoundly troubling was the empire's dire military situation. The theme system, which had reliably provided steadfast soldiers for centuries, had utterly collapsed during the Latin occupation, its farmer soldiers scattered or tragically reduced to serfdom. The professional regiments that had been the undisputed pride of earlier centuries were gone, replaced by expensive mercenary companies whose fleeting loyalty lasted only as long as their pay. The empire that had once been capable of fielding formidable armies of 50,000 men could now barely muster a few thousand, and these were often foreigners, Italian condottieri, Turkish Ghazis, Catalan almogavers, who fought solely for gold rather than for the Orthodox faith or the timeless glory of Rome. Michael VIII profoundly understood these crippling limitations better than most, and he judiciously dedicated much of his reign to crafting a sophisticated diplomatic strategy designed to compensate for overwhelming military weakness. He meticulously negotiated with the Pope, generously offering to reunite the Eastern and Western churches in exchange for desperately needed protection against the myriad enemies that perpetually surrounded his diminished realm. He forged pragmatic alliances with the Genoese against the Venetians, with the Bulgarians against the Serbs, and with the Mamluks against the remaining Crusader states, consistently striving to maintain a delicate balance of power that would effectively prevent any single enemy from becoming too perilously dangerous. The emperor's diplomatic masterpiece was the Union of Lyons in 1274, where he formally accepted papal supremacy and consented to the reunification of the churches. The agreement, however, was deeply unpopular among his deeply conservative subjects, who perceived it as an egregious betrayal of cherished Orthodox tradition. Nevertheless, it achieved its primary, crucial purpose. Pope Gregory X abandoned his support for attempts to restore the Latin Empire and instead officially recognized Michael as the legitimate ruler of Constantinople. The existential threat of a new crusade against the restored Byzantine Empire was thereby lifted, at least temporarily. Yet, the union ultimately proved to be a hollow victory. The Orthodox clergy and populace never truly accepted the submission to Rome, and Michael was tragically forced to employ increasingly harsh measures to enforce compliance with the papal agreement. Churches were unceremoniously closed, devoted priests were exiled, and even the emperor's own sister was imprisoned for her unwavering refusal to acknowledge papal authority. The empire that had been so joyfully and hopefully restored was now tragically torn apart by internal religious conflict that weakened it far more profoundly than any external enemy could ever have done. Michael's son and successor, Andronikos, too, promptly repudiated the Union of Lyons shortly after his ascension to the throne in 1282, thereby restoring Orthodox independence, but simultaneously eliminating the crucial diplomatic protection that the agreement had precariously provided. Almost immediately, new enemies began to press relentlessly upon the empire's already fragile borders. In the west, Charles of Anjou brazenly revived the Latin claim to Constantinople, meticulously assembling a formidable army and fleet for what he audaciously termed the restoration of the true empire. In the east, relentless Turkish emirates pressed ever closer to the remaining Byzantine territories in Anatolia, their fierce warriors eager for the plunder and glory that conquest would undoubtedly bring. The Sicilian Vespers of 1282 miraculously saved Byzantium from the immediate Angevin threat, as a widespread popular uprising in Sicily utterly destroyed Charles's power and compelled him to abandon his ambitious eastern designs. But the Turkish threat proved far more persistent and, ultimately, far more fatal. Led by charismatic commanders like Osman and his son Orhan, the Ottoman Beylik began its inexorable expansion from its initial base in northwestern Anatolia, systematically taking Byzantine cities one by one through a cunning combination of sustained military pressure and astute diplomatic skill. The empire's response to the relentless Turkish advance was severely hampered by debilitating internal divisions that grew progressively worse with each passing decade. The great aristocratic families, the Palaiologos, Cantacuzzinos, and Daucus clans, fought bitter and protracted civil wars for control of the throne. Each destructive conflict further weakened the empire's already diminished ability to effectively resist external enemies. The particularly devastating civil war between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzzinos in the 1340s was especially ruinous, as both sides recklessly hired foreign mercenaries and made crippling territorial concessions to secure vital military support. The most tragic and ironic aspect of these incessant civil wars was that they horrifyingly accelerated the very process they were supposedly intended to prevent. In his desperate bid to defeat John V, John VI Cantacuzzinos tragically invited Ottoman forces to cross into Europe, outrageously offering them the strategically vital fortress of Gallipoli in exchange for crucial military assistance. The Ottomans eagerly accepted the offer and then, predictably, refused to leave, thereby establishing their first permanent and ominous foothold in Europe and initiating the conquest that would eventually engulf the entire Balkan peninsula. Yet, even as the empire's territorial losses mounted inexorably, its cultural and intellectual life remarkably experienced a vibrant renaissance. The Palaiologan period witnessed a spectacular flourishing of art, literature, and scholarship that rivaled the greatest achievements of earlier centuries. Brilliant scholars like Gemistos, Plethin, and Bessarion diligently rediscovered the profound works of Plato and other ancient philosophers, while visionary artists created exquisite masterpieces of late Byzantine art that ingeniously combined traditional Orthodox themes with innovative techniques borrowed from burgeoning Italian Renaissance masters. The monasteries of Mount Athos became profound centers of mystical theology, where devout monks meticulously developed the hesychast movement, which emphasized the direct, personal experience of the divine light. The theological works of Gregory Palamas and other hesychast masters profoundly influenced Orthodox spirituality for centuries to come, while their astute political activism played a crucial role in preserving Orthodox independence in the face of repeated, coercive attempts at forced union with Rome. In Constantinople itself, the city experienced a final, glorious burst of prosperity during the early 14th century. The population, which had precipitously declined during the Latin occupation, began a heartening recovery as refugees returned from Nicaea and other Byzantine successor states. New churches were meticulously built and old ones lovingly restored, their walls adorned with breathtaking mosaics and frescoes that brilliantly demonstrated the continued vitality of Byzantine artistic traditions. The University of Constantinople was enthusiastically revived, attracting distinguished scholars from across the entire Orthodox world and even from Western Europe. where a growing interest in Greek learning was beginning to flourish. The empire's scholarly achievements during this period would have far-reaching consequences extending well beyond its rapidly shrinking borders. When Constantinople finally succumbed to the Ottomans, many of its most brilliant scholars fled to the west, carrying with them invaluable manuscripts and profound knowledge that would significantly fuel the Renaissance humanist movement. The restoration of Greek learning in Western Europe, which contributed so immeasurably to the cultural transformation of the late medieval and early modern periods, was, in large part, a priceless gift from the dedicated scholars of this final Byzantine Renaissance. Yet, none of these remarkable cultural achievements could effectively disguise the empire's fundamental and terminal weakness. By 1400, Byzantine territory had tragically shrunk to little more than Constantinople itself, the island of Lemnos, and the despotate of the Morea in southern Greece. The city that had once imperiously ruled half the Mediterranean world was now tragically surrounded by vast Ottoman territory, connected to its last remaining provinces only by the narrow, precarious sea lanes that overwhelming Ottoman naval power could effortlessly close at will. The emperors of this poignant period were truly tragic figures. Highly educated and cultured men who comprehended perfectly well the utter hopelessness of their dire situation, yet who continued to bravely struggle against impossible odds. They embarked on perilous journeys to Western Europe, desperately seeking aid that never materialized, futilely negotiated with the Pope about church union that their steadfast subjects would never accept, and watched helplessly as their beloved empire continued to shrink year by year. They were the last, courageous guardians of a civilization that had brilliantly illuminated the world for more than 1,000 years. And they performed their agonizing duty with a profound dignity that commanded respect even from their formidable enemies. As the 15th century relentlessly progressed, it became chillingly clear that the inevitable end was rapidly approaching. The Ottoman Empire, under the ruthless Murad II and later the ambitious Mehmed II, had become the undisputed dominant power in southeastern Europe and Western Asia, commanding resources that dwarfed anything the Byzantines could conceivably hope to match. Yet, still the empire stoically endured, a flickering light in the gathering darkness, sustained by the stubborn courage of its people and the ancient, unwavering belief that Constantinople was under the special, divine protection of the Virgin Mary. The final, ultimate test of that profound faith was yet to come. The winter of 1452 passed with an unusual and ominous severity over Constantinople, the sacred waters of the Golden Horn freezing solid for the first time in living memory. The beleaguered citizens interpreted it as a chilling omen, though whether for good or ill, none could say with certainty. In the narrow, winding streets of the old city, where astute Byzantine merchants had once grown rich on the lucrative silk trade with distant China, refugees from the relentless Ottoman conquests in Anatolia huddled miserably around braziers, their faces gaunt with gnawing hunger, and their eyes hollow with the terrifying certainty that far worse times lay ominously ahead. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last of his ancient and noble line, spent the dark, cold months of winter in solemn prayer and meticulous preparation. He was 48 years old, a man who had never anticipated ascending to the throne. The imperial crown had come to him only after the tragic deaths of his older brothers, and he had accepted it with the profound resignation of one who understood, with chilling clarity, that he was tragically destined to preside over the final, heartbreaking chapter of a magnificent story that had begun with Constantine the Great more than 11 centuries prior. In the cold, quiet hours before dawn, he could often be found kneeling humbly before the venerable icon of the Virgin Hodegetria in the palace chapel, his lips silently moving in fervent prayer for the ultimate salvation of his beloved city and his loyal people. Across the narrow, strategic waters of the Bosphorus, in the rolling hills of Anatolia, Sultan Mehmed II was undertaking very different, yet equally meticulous, preparations. At just 21, he was remarkably younger than the very empire he meticulously planned to utterly destroy. But he possessed an intelligence and a ruthless cunning that had already indelibly marked him as one of the most formidable rulers of his age. The Byzantines derisively called him the young wolf. And they were not far from the chilling truth. He possessed the predatory instinct for identifying weakness, the hunter's unwavering patience in stalking his chosen prey, and the killer's unyielding determination to finish what he had unequivocally begun. Mehmed had been obsessively dreaming of Constantinople since his earliest childhood. His erudite tutors had filled his impressionable mind with captivating stories of the great city's legendary wealth and unparalleled beauty, while his shrewd military advisors had consistently underscored its paramount strategic importance as the absolute key to controlling the vital passage between Europe and Asia. Previous Ottoman sultans had been content to leave the Byzantine Empire as a seemingly harmless rump state, perceiving it as more useful as a strategic buffer than a target for costly conquest. But Mehmed, with his visionary and ruthless foresight, viewed things entirely differently. As long as Constantinople remained in Christian hands, it would forever serve as an impotent symbol of persistent resistance to Ottoman expansion, a potential rallying point for future, dreaded crusades, and a dangerous, inherent weakness in the Ottoman Empire's defenses. The young Sultan's preparations were meticulously methodical and truly terrifying in their sheer scope. Throughout the brutal winter of 1452 to 1453, Ottoman engineers worked tirelessly and relentlessly to construct the formidable fortress of Rumeli-Hizari on the European shore of the Bosphorus. Positioned directly across from the older Asian fortress of Anadolu-Hizari that his great-grandfather had built 50 years prior. Together, these two strategically positioned fortresses could exert absolute, complete control over shipping through the Bosphorus, effectively cutting Constantinople off from any potential aid that might attempt to arrive from the Black Sea or the empire's last remaining territories in the Morea. The brazen construction of Rumeli-Hizari was a deliberate and unambiguous act of war, a flagrant violation of the long-standing agreements that had precariously allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive as an Ottoman vassal state. When Constantine, in a desperate attempt, dispatched ambassadors to protest the fortress's construction, Mehmed, with chilling ruthlessness, had them executed. A clear and unmistakable signal that the time for delicate diplomacy had decisively passed. The towering walls of Rumeli-Hizari rose with almost supernatural speed, its imposing towers and battlements rapidly taking shape as winter grudgingly gave way to spring, while colossal Ottoman cannons were strategically positioned to sink any vessel that dared to attempt to run the straits without express permission. In the workshops of Adrianople, the Ottoman capital, the brilliant Hungarian engineer Orban was meticulously perfecting the ultimate weapon that would render the ancient walls of Constantinople as utterly obsolete as bronze spears in an age of steel. His magnificent great cannon, ominously dubbed Basilica by the terrified Greeks who would soon face its destructive power, was a monstrous creation of bronze and iron, nearly 30 feet long, and terrifyingly capable of hurling massive stone balls weighing more than half a ton. No fortification in the known world had been built to withstand such devastating weapons. And the venerable walls of Constantinople, for all their legendary strength and storied history, were about to confront their ultimate, existential test. As spring arrived in 1453, the diplomatic situation grew increasingly desperate for the Byzantines. Constantine, in a final, desperate plea, sent envoys to every Christian court in Europe, fervently begging for desperately needed aid against the overwhelming Ottoman threat. The responses were uniformly and profoundly disappointing. The fiercely independent Italian city-states were too deeply embroiled in their own internal wars to spare precious soldiers for Constantinople. The Hungarian kingdom was utterly exhausted from its own protracted struggles with the Ottomans, and the major Western European powers were either too geographically distant or too deeply suspicious of Greek orthodoxy to commit significant resources to the city's desperate defense. The Pope, in a final gesture, offered aid, but only in exchange for the formal and permanent reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, a painful price that Constantine was reluctantly prepared to pay, though he knew with certainty it would tragically divide his own people at the very moment when absolute unity was most critically essential. On December 12, 1452, a solemn, poignant ceremony was held in the Hagia Sophia to formally proclaim the union of the churches, with Cardinal Isidore of Kiev celebrating Mass according to the Latin rite, while the Emperor and a mere handful of loyal courtiers looked on. The magnificent great church was almost eerily empty. Most of the city's pious population had stayed away in silent protest, and even many of the clergy defiantly refused to participate in what they overwhelmingly perceived as a sacrilegious betrayal of their cherished faith. The union ceremony provided little practical benefit. A few hundred Genoese soldiers arrived under the command of Giovanni Justiniani, a professional and highly skilled soldier who rapidly emerged as the most effective defender of the land wall. But no major Western power dispatched significant aid. The Byzantine Empire would face its final, agonizing siege essentially alone, defended by perhaps a mere 7,000 men, a desperate mixture of courageous Byzantine soldiers, a handful of Italian mercenaries, and civilian volunteers, against a colossal Ottoman army that may have numbered a staggering 150,000. The siege officially commenced on April 6, 1453. When overwhelming Ottoman forces successfully completed their total encirclement of the city. Mehmed's army was a truly cosmopolitan force that vividly reflected the immense diversity of his rapidly expanding empire. It comprised resolute Turkish infantry and cavalry, loyal Serbian and Bulgarian auxiliaries, skilled Hungarian artillerymen, and brilliant engineers from across Europe who had flocked to serve the Sultan for either glittering gold or the promise of glory. The Ottoman fleet, though numerically smaller than the land army, was sufficiently large to complete the suffocating blockade by effectively controlling the crucial waters of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara for 7 relentless weeks. The greatest siege in medieval history agonizingly unfolded before the ancient, scarred walls of Constantinople. The relentless Ottoman artillery, including Orban's colossal great cannon, mercilessly pounded the ancient fortifications day and night, creating gaping breaches that the desperately struggling defenders valiantly tried to repair. The Byzantines fought with the courage born of sheer desperation, knowing instinctively that defeat meant not merely the end of their cherished empire, but the utter destruction of their civilization itself. They rolled barrels of Greek fire onto the attacking hordes, hurled a ceaseless barrage of stones and arrows from the battlements, and launched desperate, suicidal sorties to destroy the colossal siege engines that relentlessly crept ever closer to their beleaguered defenses. The city's population, swollen by waves of terrified refugees from across the dying empire, stoically endured the siege with a complex mixture of terror and unyielding defiance. In the sacred churches, priests led constant, fervent prayers for divine deliverance, while in the chaotic streets, citizens worked frantically to reinforce the crumbling walls with whatever disparate materials they could desperately find. Stones salvaged from ruined buildings, timber from dismantled houses, and even priceless marble from ancient, revered monuments. Children as young as 10 bravely carried water and meager food to the exhausted defenders, while women, with incredible sacrifice, melted down their cherished jewelry to provide precious metal for weapons and essential repairs. Emperor Constantine himself became the very soul of the tenacious resistance. Each day found him bravely on the walls, sharing the immense dangers faced by his soldiers, tirelessly encouraging the weary, and demonstrating by his unwavering presence that the last emperor of Byzantium would never surrender his beloved city without a fierce, unyielding fight. He had, with humble resolve, cast aside the ostentatious purple robes of imperial majesty for the practical, unadorned armor of a common soldier, and those who witnessed him during those final, agonizing weeks remembered not a defeated monarch, but a valiant warrior king truly worthy of the legendary heroes of ancient Troy. The most dramatic moment of the siege arrived when Mehmed audaciously attempted to break the Byzantine control of the Golden Horn by transporting his ships overland. Under the concealing cloak of darkness, ingenious Ottoman engineers meticulously greased wooden rollers and, with immense effort, hauled more than 70 vessels across the hills of Pera, launching them into the vital waters behind the great chain that had protected the harbor for so many centuries. The shocking sight of Ottoman ships majestically sailing in waters that had been securely in Byzantine hands since the city's very founding delivered a profound psychological blow that struck the aura. Audi demoralized defenders like a physical wound. Yet still the city miraculously held. The walls, though severely battered and visibly breached in several strategic places, continued to defiantly stand, while the defenders' flagging spirits were miraculously sustained by ancient prophecies that solemnly promised Constantinople would never, under any circumstances, fall to unbelievers. Some optimistically pointed to the dramatic lunar eclipse that occurred during the siege as an undeniable sign of divine favor, while others found profound comfort in the enduring legend that the city would courageously endure until the very end of time, protected by the benevolent Virgin Mary herself. As May drew inexorably toward its close, both opposing sides were rapidly approaching a state of utter exhaustion. The massive Ottoman army, despite its overwhelming numerical superiority, had suffered heavy and unsustainable casualties in its repeated, ferocious assaults, while Mehmed himself was under increasing pressure from his impatient advisers to abandon the protracted siege before the potential arrival of a relief army, or the harsh approach of winter, rendered continued operations utterly impossible. The valiant defenders, meanwhile, were rapidly running critically short of gunpowder, desperately needed food, and most critically, able-bodied men. Every passing day brought new, irreplaceable casualties. The final, decisive assault was tragically scheduled for May 29th, the ominous anniversary of the city's very founding. Mehmed commanded his monstrous cannons to fire continuously through the long, agonizing night, their thunderous roar echoing ominously across the waters of the Bosphorus like the terrifying voice of approaching doom. In the hallowed Hagia Sophia, Constantine attended what he must have known would be his last divine liturgy, receiving communion with a solemnity that profoundly moved even his relentless enemies to a momentary, grudging respect. As dawn agonizingly approached, he delivered his final, impassioned speech to the valiant defenders, reminding them that they fought not merely for their beloved city, but for their sacred faith, their cherished families, and the glorious memory of 1,000 years of unparalleled glory. The final attack commenced before sunrise with waves of Ottoman irregulars brutally hurling themselves against the walls in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to utterly exhaust the defenders' rapidly dwindling ammunition and physical energy. These Bashi Bazooks, as they were scornfully called, were primarily volunteers seeking mere plunder rather than professional soldiers, but their sheer, overwhelming numbers were so vast that they nearly overwhelmed the walls through sheer, relentless mass. For 2 grueling hours the battle raged with unprecedented fury, the very air thick with the acrid smoke from booming cannons and the terrifying stench of Greek fire, the ground slick with the spilled blood from both armies. The critical and ultimately fatal breakthrough occurred at the Kirkaporta, a small, obscure gate in the mighty land wall that had, through some unfathomable oversight, been left unlocked during the night. A small group of Ottoman soldiers miraculously discovered the opening and poured through, catching the exhausted defenders in the rear and instantly creating widespread panic along the wall. At almost precisely the same moment, the Janissaries, the elite, formidable troops of the Ottoman army, launched their final, devastating assault on the main breach where Giovanni Justiniani had tragically fallen wounded, and his men were visibly wavering. Emperor Constantine, perceiving with chilling clarity that the end had finally arrived, courageously stripped off his imperial regalia so that his body could not be identified and dishonored by the conquering victors. With a mere handful of loyal companions, he bravely charged into the thickest, most desperate fighting at the breach, sword resolutely in hand, stoically choosing to die as a valiant soldier rather than live as an ignominious captive. His body was never definitively found among the thousands of mangled corpses that littered the walls. though Ottoman soldiers later claimed to have discovered a headless body wearing telltale purple boots that might have been the remains of the last emperor. By noon on May 29, 1453, the magnificent city of Constantine was firmly in Ottoman hands. Mehmed the Conqueror triumphantly entered through the very same Golden Gate where Michael VIII Palaiologos had proudly processed in victory 2 centuries before. Riding slowly and deliberately through streets strewn with the grim debris of conquest. His first, symbolic destination was the Hagia Sophia, where he dismounted and knelt in solemn prayer, thereby symbolically transforming the great church into a mosque and definitively marking the absolute end of the Byzantine Empire. The sack that ensued was less destructive than the one brutally carried out by the Crusaders in 1204, but it was thorough enough to complete the devastation. The Sultan had promised his victorious soldiers 3 days of plunder, and they made the absolute most of their grim opportunity, carrying away whatever remaining treasures had miraculously survived the previous sacks and sieges. Many of the city's remaining inhabitants were tragically enslaved, though Mehmed, with pragmatic foresight, was careful to preserve the skilled craftsmen and astute merchants who could contribute significantly to his burgeoning empire's future prosperity. The cataclysmic fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves of profound grief and disbelief reverberating throughout the entire Christian world. Church bells tolled in mourning from distant Moscow to faraway London, while scholars who had bravely fled the dying empire carried with them invaluable manuscripts and profound knowledge that would, ironically, help to fuel the burgeoning Renaissance in Western Europe. The devastating news reached some remote corners of Europe only months later, carried by weary merchants and stunned diplomats who could scarcely believe that the city which had valiantly withstood so many previous sieges had finally, irrevocably fallen. Yet, within the conquered city itself, life gradually and stoically returned to a new kind of normalcy. Mehmed, who now boldly styled himself as the rightful heir to both the Ottoman and Roman imperial traditions, meticulously worked to restore Constantinople's lost prosperity and diminished population. He actively invited Greek merchants to return, painstakingly rebuilt the extensively damaged neighborhoods, and even, in a gesture of surprising tolerance, appointed a new Orthodox patriarch to minister to the city's remaining Christian population. The great city would indeed rise again, not as the glorious capital of a Christian empire, but as the magnificent seat of a formidable Muslim sultanate that would dominate southeastern Europe and Western Asia for centuries to come. As the sun finally set over the Bosphorus on that historic day in 1453, it marked the end of more than just an empire. It was the profound conclusion of a magnificent story that had commenced when Constantine the Great first gazed across these very same waters and envisioned a new Rome for a new, burgeoning age. The Byzantine Empire, the last living remnant of the ancient Roman world, had at long last succumbed after more than 1,000 years of unparalleled glory and relentless struggle, triumphant victories and heartbreaking tragedies. In the gathering twilight, the majestic great dome of the Hagia Sophia still defiantly caught the last, fading light of day, its golden surface reflecting the flickering fires that burned throughout the conquered city. Tomorrow, the call to prayer would resonate from its towering minarets for the very first time. But tonight, in the sacred, profound silence between the old world and the new, it remained what it had always been, a timeless testament to unwavering human faith. A magnificent monument to unparalleled artistic genius, and a celestial bridge between earth and heaven that would bravely endure long after the empires that had painstakingly built it had gracefully passed into mere memory. The grand story of Byzantium was finally finished, but its enduring legacy would live on in the captivating art and breathtaking architecture, the meticulous laws and inspiring literature, the profound faith and philosophical wisdom that had so vibrantly flourished within its hallowed borders. From the ascetic monasteries of Mount Athos to the esteemed universities of Western Europe, from the ancient churches of Russia to the illuminated libraries of Italy, the profound influence of the Byzantine Empire would continue to powerfully shape human civilization long after the last emperor had bravely fallen and the double-headed eagle had been symbolically placed by the crescent moon. The empire was undeniably dead. But its indomitable spirit, the spirit of a resilient people who had valiantly preserved the radiant light of learning through the darkest, most tumultuous ages and fearlessly defended the very gates of Europe against overwhelming odds, would prove as immortal as the beloved city they had so fiercely loved and ultimately, tragically lost. In the end, perhaps that profound legacy was enough. For more than 11 centuries, Constantinople had steadfastly stood as a radiant beacon of unwavering faith and profound culture. A vital bridge between East and West, ancient and modern, the divine and the human. It had painstakingly preserved the invaluable wisdom of the classical world through the bewildering chaos of the Dark Ages. Created breathtaking works of art and architecture that still inspire boundless wonder after half a millennium, and undeniably demonstrated that human civilization could, against all odds, endure even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The last Byzantine emperor had bravely fallen defending the sacred walls of his city. But the noble ideals for which he gallantly died, the unshakable belief in the inherent dignity of human learning, the profound conviction that beauty and truth were eternally worth defending, the unwavering faith that even in the deepest darkness there could still be light, these eternal ideals would outlive all the transient empires that relentlessly rose and ultimately fell around them. In the end, that was the true, enduring victory of Byzantium. Not the ephemeral conquest of territory or the mere accumulation of fleeting wealth, but the priceless preservation of what was truly best and most enduring in human culture for future generations to painstakingly discover, to profoundly cherish, and to gracefully pass on in their own turn. The Byzantine Empire was no more. But its captivating story would continue to be told as long as human beings gathered to remember the profound past and courageously dream of the boundless future. In the soft whisper of wind through the majestic dome of the Hagia Sophia, in the shimmering glimmer of gold in an ancient, timeless mosaic, in the resonant sound of Byzantine chant echoing profoundly through Orthodox churches around the entire world, the empire lived on. Not as a mere political entity, but as something infinitely more precious and enduring, a timeless testament to the indomitable human spirit and the eternal, transformative power of hope over despair, of radiant light over profound darkness, of cherished memory over ultimate oblivion.